So a while back, it might have been like, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, give or take, I made a video on genocides committed by non-white peoples throughout history. And I think, in my opinion, it might be the most important video I have ever made in the sense that I think it's a very important subject for red pilling people on. And you could say it's one of those like baby's first red pills, but I remember like I didn't learn about a lot of these non-white genocides until I was already in my 20s. And when I learned about it, it made me feel like I'd been lied to my entire life. Because back then, the narrative was very strongly promoted that, like, genocide was the exclusive territory of white people. Like, we're the only people in human history who've ever committed genocide on a large scale. And maybe the only exception that we were really taught about was Rwanda. That was the one and only exception. And that's because it was relatively recent and also quite large scale and very efficient. You know, never doubt African efficiency in that regard. But yeah, looking back at that video, a lot has changed between then and now. And I feel like these days you'd have to be pretty stupid and ignorant to deny all these non-white genocides. Like, I feel like the information has gotten out a bit more, like the cat is out of the bag a bit more. And most people who aren't complete morons do not still go around believing that white people are the only people on earth who have committed genocide on a large scale. You'd have to be so ignorant with all the information out there nowadays to think that. But that being said, I've seen them shift their argument, as people often do when they're making a losing argument. They shift the goalposts. They say, well, okay, fine, you proved me wrong about that, but, however, what about this? And it's like, when they keep constantly shifting the goalposts, like, usually it's a sign that the person is just losing the argument. But that being said, okay, I'm going to go through one by one the claims that they make that supposedly make white people uniquely evil, or supposedly make the genocides that we have committed, or slavery, colonialism, etc., worse than the atrocities committed by non-whites. So I'm going to go through them one by one. Okay, the first claim is that the genocides and atrocities we've committed happened recently, whereas the atrocities committed by non-whites happened a long time ago. So they point to the Mongol Empire, for instance, and they say, well, it happened so long ago, who even cares? Although, funny enough, that doesn't apply to the Crusades or to the expulsion of the Jews by the Romans. It doesn't apply to any of those things, but it does apply to the Mongol Empire. And it's like, okay, well, if you want to talk about recency, I mean, the genocide by the Turks against the Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, that was in the 20th century. So was the atrocities by the Japanese in World War II, which many people do consider genocide. I've seen massive debates over the death toll of civilians by Japan in World War II. Anything like I've seen it range from in terms of acts that are considered genocidal. Some people only count the rape of Nanking, but some people go so far as to count a billion other things. So I don't know. It's hard to say the exact number, but there's that. And the genocide by the Turks, okay, there's that. There's Rwanda. There's the genocide in Darfur. There's the ongoing genocide by Israel in Gaza. There's a cultural genocide of the Uyghurs and Tibetans by China. Why do I feel okay, if we're going to count genocides against one's own people, there's the Great Leap Forward in Cambodia. The Great Leap Forward in China, and the genocides by Pol Pot in Cambodia. The Killing Fields. So there's all these genocides in the 20th or 21st century. And of course, the ongoing never-ending genocide in the Congo. That just keeps going on and on. So yeah, there's been all these in the 20th or 21st century. So right off the bat, like it's bullshit. Like the Papuan genocide by Indonesia in Irian Jaya. So all these were relatively recent, like 20th or 21st centuries. Um, so that claim right there is bullshit. And some of these are very large scale, like Japan in World War II and the Turkish genocides against the Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. Like some of these are quite large, and Rwanda, obviously. Um, and of course, Great Leap Forward and Killing Fields in Cambodia, if you're counting genocides against one's own people, not against an external people. So yeah, I mean, that's a lot right there. So next is the size of the genocide. The idea that like white people have all the high scores. It's like, well, there's the Mongols, the Mughals and Timurids, their invasions of India. Those are all very high scores. The Turks scored pretty high also, with the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian genocide. Japan in World War II, like I've said, the estimates range so like the range of estimates is just so wild. Like they just vary so wildly that it's hard to say. I'd really have to do more research into that, but I don't know. It could be in the millions potentially. Yeah, Rwanda, that's a million. And again, the alleged death tolls of like centuries ago, like the Mongols, Mughals, Timurids, like those genocides could have hypothetically been in the tens of millions. It's very hard to say for that long ago, but the Mongol conquest of much of Asia and Europe was extremely bloody, as were the Mughal and Timurid conquests in the Indian subcontinent. So yeah, people originating from Central Asia definitely racked up some serious high scores at the time. In that, I think roughly 12th to 14th centuries, give or take. Yeah, some serious high scores back then. And some of the 20th century ones were definitely getting scores of at least the neighborhood of like 1 to 2 million, and possibly more in the case of Japan in World War II. But that one, again, it just varies so wildly, the estimates. And then we have, if we're including genocides against one's own people, like the Great Leap Forward in China would be one of the biggest in history. And again, people could argue, oh, it wasn't intentional, it was just starvation, but it's like, okay, fair enough. But, and again, that's something that's hotly debated. Like, there are many people who claim, yes, it was intentional. So, I mean, either way, like, we have some very impressive high scores there. So the next factor is intent to exterminate. Like the argument, like, yes, a lot of these genocides may have been very bloody, but the goal was not extermination. Whereas with white people, we have committed genocides where the goal was extermination. And it's like, okay, right off the bat, the Rwanda genocide was definitely about extermination. And the Turkish genocides against Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, that was definitely about exterminating them, at very least from Turkish soil. Perhaps not from the face of the planet, but definitely from Turkish soil. So yes, there definitely have been genocides by non-whites, at least in those two cases where extermination was definitely part of the goal. And okay, moving on. Okay, another argument is that, oh, non-whites tend to kill their own people, whereas whites tend to kill other races. Again, I think I've gone through this already. Like most of the only ones I've listed that are really against one's own people are the Great Leap Forward in China and the Killing Fields in Cambodia. In most other cases, it was at very least against someone of another ethnicity. Now, they could use the argument other ethnicity versus other race. And it's like, hold on, you're acknowledging that race exists? Okay, but even if I accept the premise, it's like, well, I mean, why does it particularly matter? Even if it's like, oh, it was the same race but different ethnicity, it's like, okay, but they would say the same about the Holocaust, that was a genocide against other ethnicities of the same race. So it's like, does that disqualify the severity of the Holocaust? I mean, because most of the people who make these arguments believe that Jews and whites are the same race, even if they're different ethnicities. And they would definitely say that like Germans and Poles are the same race. So it's like, I don't know. This is kind of like, this whole argument is really like, okay, yes, most non-white genocides were against ethnicities that could be considered the same race in a broad sense. However, not all, because, okay, if you look at the Mongols, they killed people of distinctly other racial groups. They killed plenty of white people. Also, the Mughals and Timurids from Central Asia killed a lot of people in the Indian subcontinent. So that, again, another race. Yeah, and the Mongols killed other races in Asia too. Like, I mean, they would have gone across lands where the people are more brown, so that would be another race. Like, I don't know how many races you could divide humanity into. There's debate over that, but I'm just saying some of these genocides definitely were against another race, at least partially, for whatever that is worth. But again, I severely question, it's like, why is this a major differentiating factor? If it was against another ethnicity of the same race versus another race entirely. But even if you accept that that's a valid premise to differentiate based on, it's like, okay, the Mongols, the Mughals, the Timurids all did kill people of other races. Okay, the next argument is that white people have committed genocides that were based on racial, and also not just genocides, but enslavement and colonialism based on racial theories of supremacy, like genetically based scientific racism or theories of genetic supremacy, whereas non-whites did not. They just killed people based on greed, desire for land, desire for power, basic Game of Thrones type stuff, as opposed to like genetic superiority. And it's like, again, I would say that's a big fat so what? It's like, why does that make it fundamentally worse if you're killing someone because you think they're genetically inferior, or if you're killing someone just because you want to take their land and subjugate them? But for argument's sake, okay, the Japanese in World War II did have theories of genetic racial superiority. They viewed themselves as genetically superior to other East Asians and as the basic, the rightful rulers of all of East Asia. They had theories basically similar to the Nazi theories of Nordicism, only in an East Asian context. So the Japanese would count in World War II by that standard. Like the Hutus and Tutsis, even in Rwanda, they did have this theory of them being like genetically different based on like facial features and things like that. Even if you go back to Arab slavery of blacks, there were sentiments expressed in historic literature of Arabs viewing blacks as genetically inferior based on their race, and that was part of the motivation for castrating so many of their slaves, because they didn't want them to reproduce. So, I mean, I would say yes, there have been instances of that. Was it as formalized in like the literature and scientific theories? I mean, maybe just in the case of the Japanese, but still, it's like, okay, that is still one definite case of that. So, I mean, again, I don't think it's the most important criteria, but even if they're going to say that, fine. The Japanese in World War II definitely would qualify for that. Okay, so the next criteria would be, do these genocides still affect the victims today? I would say absolutely yes. The Mongol genocides and like the Mongol Empire was so far reaching that many of the countries were impoverished for centuries as a result, and potentially to this very day. Large portions of Europe and Asia are poorer now than they otherwise would have been because the Mongols ravaged them so hard. Um, I mean, I don't know exactly how much of the economic status of countries today can be attributed to past victimization, but I mean, are countries in East Asia still suffering from what the Japanese did in World War II, like economically, materially, and otherwise? Quite possibly. I don't know. I'd have to do more research into that, but I'd say there's a very good chance. Okay, Armenians, are they still? They're definitely a case. They're definitely still suffering as a result of the genocide by the Turks. Like, I don't see how that's even debatable. And the Assyrians and Greeks, but I mean, the Greeks to a lesser extent, but I would say definitely Armenians for sure. And probably Greeks and Assyrians also to a good extent. Like, I mean, Armenia is a tiny, impoverished country. There's no way in hell that they're not suffering still today as a result of the Armenian genocide, not to mention their numbers being severely reduced. There'd probably be a lot more Armenians in the world today if the Armenian genocide hadn't happened. So they have this tiny landlocked country in the Caucasus that is a fraction of the territory that used to be Armenia historically. So I don't see how you could argue that they're not still suffering from the results of that genocide. And they've almost been completely eradicated from Turkey. So yeah, I mean, I don't, and their cultural legacy has been largely erased from many parts of that region, like from Turkey. So it's like, I don't see how that's even debatable in that case, that they're still suffering from it. I mean, I'm sure obviously Tutsis in Rwanda are still suffering from the outcome of that genocide. That wasn't that long ago. And okay, you want to talk about still suffering? Gaza. Nuff said. The Gazans are still suffering from the genocide that is currently going on there. So, like, yeah, there's a lot of exceptions to this, to the point where it's like, I mean, are there any of these genocides that nobody's suffering from still? I don't know. I do not know, but like, to me, it seems like, yes, a lot of people are still suffering from the consequences of at least many of them. Not to mention, again, all the other genocides in Africa in the 20th and 21st centuries. Like West Papua, still controlled by Indonesia. So, yeah, that brings me to my next point, which is, are the perpetrators still benefiting today? Are they still wealthy today, as at least partially as a result of these genocides, colonialism, and subjugation? And it's like, I mean, I guess that's the one area where it's like, okay, what a lot of these white colonialist powers are considerably wealthier today than a lot of these non-white countries that committed these genocide, or non-white ethnic groups that committed these genocides in the past. It is true. Like, if you use GDP per capita as your metric, the only non-white country that really committed a massive genocide that's comparable would be Japan, I guess. Or I suppose the Persian Gulf oil countries, because they participated in like spreading Islam by the sword, not to mention the slave trade of Africans. But to be fair, you could argue in their case, their wealth is because of oil, and it has nothing to do with those atrocities. And in fact, they became dirt poor between when those atrocities were happening and when they discovered oil. Therefore, there's not as much of a causal link to their wealth. Okay, fair enough. Although I'm not sure how recently slavery of Africans ended in the region, but it doesn't matter, because the point is, okay, I will grant the premise that the Gulf Arabs were dirt poor at one point in recent memory before the oil boom. So yes, okay, fair enough. I guess the only one of these countries that's still really a rich country, relatively speaking, is Japan. And I mean, is Japan rich because of World War II? I mean, I don't know how much of a role World War II played in building their economy. Well, it definitely built their military and technological acceleration to some extent. So I guess they might have technologically benefited from the war in that sense. There was probably a ripple effect that helped them with their post-war economic boom. So I guess economically, Japan did benefit from the war in some ways. And definitely was hurt by it in others because they lost. But despite losing the war, like as with Germany, there was an economic boom afterwards. So perhaps the war did facilitate that to some extent, even though they lost. So I mean, in the case of Japan, you could say there could be a causal link there, and that they're a wealthy country today, at least partly because of the war and because of their role in the war and the associated genocidal acts. So I guess you could say Japan there. So it's like, okay, I guess that's the one argument they have, is that these white countries are wealthier today. But at the same time, it's like, I mean, so what? Does that really determine guilt? I mean, I guess if you're really a hardcore Marxist, then yes. But like also, I mean, it definitely doesn't let like say Portugal off the hook because they're kind of at the lower end of first world, like GDP per capita wise. It definitely doesn't let Portugal off the hook. So, I mean, but then again, you could say, yeah, but Portugal is still wealthier significantly than like Mongolia or China, although China's getting up there, they're increasing in wealth quite a bit, or like, Uzbekistan, or well, obviously like Rwanda, or basically like any country that could be linked to these atrocities. Like I guess there's the wealth argument, but it's like, I don't know, it's kind of arguing that like if two people commit similar crimes, but one of them is wealthier, the wealthier one is automatically more guilty, even if the crimes themselves are relatively equivalent. And keep in mind, this is talking about like how wealthy they are now, not how wealthy they were necessarily at the time, because some of these genocides were hundreds of years ago. So it's like, I guess the idea that white people still materially benefit more, but it's like, at the same time, it's like just because we materially benefit more doesn't make us uniquely evil. And it doesn't mean that we somehow have this unique cultural predisposition toward wiping out, enslaving, subjugating, colonizing other peoples. It's just that we were more successful at maintaining the wealth that was generated from those endeavors and just from other endeavors. Like, it's not like all of our wealth comes from colonialism or genocide. But it's like, again, it's kind of like this Marxist idea that like you should hate people for being successful, I guess, even if two people commit equivalent crimes, but one succeeds more, like profits more at the end of the day from them. But I don't know. I don't know if that's entirely fair. But I guess that's probably their most legitimate argument. But again, I would say it's a big fat so what to some extent. And also it's like they make all these other arguments that are clearly bullshit. So it's like, I guess their closest thing to a point is the idea that like, oh, genocide only matters if you're rich. Like, not even if you were rich when you committed the genocide, but if you're rich now. I guess that's basically their only argument. But it's on a moral level, I think it's bullshit. On a moral level, it's complete bullshit to say that white people are uniquely evil or have a unique predilection for evil just because we've been able to keep the fruits of our labor for longer. And yes, in some cases, ill-gotten fruits, but not all cases, but in some, yes. But it doesn't change the fact that there were plenty of ill-gotten fruits by other peoples as well. It's just that those ill-gotten fruits have not translated into long-term wealth to the same extent, with the possible exception of the Japanese and China now increasingly as well. Because China has its own colonialist history, after all, against various peoples in the west of China. Like I think it's the Dzungars, I think, were people that they committed genocide against in the 19th century. Yeah, so it's like, and obviously there's the ongoing cultural genocides against Tibet and the Uyghurs today, the Tibetans and Uyghurs. So yeah, I mean, China increasingly would join Japan in that category also, as a country that is benefiting materially and economically. And as they continue to grow economically, it'll be harder and harder to deny that. And again, even in the case of Turkey, like, they're not a super wealthy country, but I mean, they have some wealth for sure. Like, they have some power on a global stage. They're not the poorest of the poor, that's for sure. Although Turkey, to be fair, is undergoing some of the same trends that European countries, like European and European descended countries, are. Like, they're also dealing with mass immigration and demographic change on a countrywide scale. So the Turks, if it's to be believed that, like, demographic change is some sort of moral consequence of colonialism, then I guess the Turks, or genocide or whatever, then I guess the Turks are experiencing that also. And so are white people who didn't participate in it, like the Irish and the Finns, but it's like, well, they're white, so they're guilty by association. Funny how that doesn't work for other races. But, like, nobody's saying the Koreans are guilty by association for the actions of other East Asian peoples. But yeah, I mean, I guess those are the main factors that allegedly separate whites from other races in terms of our atrocities. And yeah, let me know your thoughts. So that's all I got for now.